The last greasy remnants of our burgers sat cooling in their red plastic baskets, a sad monument to a meal that had ended hours ago. It was past midnight, and the 24-hour diner at the frayed edge of town was a lonely island of fluorescent light in a vast, dark sea of sleeping storefronts. Leo and I had been there since 10, lost in the comfortable currents of shared history, talking over lukewarm, bitter coffee about the high school triumphs that felt like another lifetime, and the grand, amorphous future plans that we both knew would likely evaporate with the morning sun. "I should probably get going," I said, stretching until my spine popped in a series of satisfying cracks. "Early start tomorrow. Got that shipment coming in at the warehouse." Leo nodded, but he didn't move. He just sat there, his gaze lost in the swirling dregs at the bottom of his empty coffee mug.
"Yeah, me too."
The walk to my car, a beat-up sedan parked a block down the desolate street, was quiet, the silence broken only by the hum of the diner's neon sign and the scuff of our shoes on the cracked pavement. The air was cool and heavy with the damp, earthy smell of impending rain. It was then that I noticed Leo's pace had slowed, his usually confident strides becoming a shuffling, uncertain limp. I glanced over, my brow furrowing with concern. In the jaundiced, sputtering glow of a solitary lamppost, his face was a waxy, bloodless mask. He brought a trembling hand up to his temples, rubbing them in a slow, pained circle, as if trying to physically push a headache out of his skull. "Everything okay, man?" I asked, a sliver of genuine concern cutting through my post-diner lethargy. That last chili dog finally staging a mutiny? He tried to smile, but it was a pained, grotesque twitch of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. Leaning heavily against the rusting metal pole of the lamppost, he shook his head, a slow, weak motion.
"No, it's, different,"
he mumbled, his voice so thin it was almost carried away by the night breeze. He winced, a sharp intake of breath, and his free hand flew to his stomach, clutching it tightly as if trying to hold himself together.
"Everything's spinning, like the world is tilting on its axis." He swayed on his feet, his eyes losing focus, the vibrant blue I knew so well clouding over into a dull, unfocused grey.
I closed the distance between us in 2 quick strides, my own heart beginning to thud with a nervous rhythm. I grabbed his arm just as his knees buckled, a dead weight collapsing with terrifying speed. All pretense of joking vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. His full weight sagged against me, and I grunted with the effort of holding him up. I could feel a violent tremor running through his entire body, a ceaseless, high-frequency vibration, and hear the ragged, shallow gasps he was pulling into his lungs. This wasn't food poisoning. This was something else, something terrifyingly sudden and brutally violent. "Come on," I grunted, looping his limp arm over my shoulders, the dead weight of him a shocking reality. "We need to get you to the hospital, now." The short journey to the car was a nightmare of dead weight, frantic effort, and Leo's low, guttural moans. I practically poured him into the passenger seat, his body slumping bonelessly against the door. He collapsed against it, his head lulling against the cool glass of the window, leaving a trail of condensation from his shallow breaths. I fumbled with his seatbelt, my fingers clumsy and slick with a cold sweat of panic. His skin was clammy and unnaturally cold to the touch, like marble, and his breathing had become a faint, almost imperceptible flutter against his lips. Wasting no more time, I slammed his door shut, jumped into the driver's seat, and tore away from the curb, the tires squealing in protest against the asphalt. The town was a ghost ship, utterly silent and still. The roads were eerily empty, bathed in a strange, pale bluish light from the overhead lamps that made the familiar streets look alien and surreal, like a set for a movie I didn't want to be in. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my own breathing a harsh counterpoint to the unnerving, profound silence in the car. When the stark, illuminated sign for St. Michael's Hospital finally cut through the oppressive darkness, a beacon of sterile hope, I didn't slow down. I swerved into the emergency entrance, the car skidding to a halt just shy of the curb. The automatic doors slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss, a sigh of sterile, chilled air greeting us as if the building itself were exhaling. Half dragging, half carrying Leo's limp form, I stumbled into the emergency room. The transition was jarring, a violent assault on the senses. The world went from deep, silent blue to a blinding, fluorescent white that made my eyes burn and my head ache. The air buzzed, a high-frequency hum that vibrated deep in my teeth, the sound of institutional decay. I yelled, my voice cracking under the strain, sounding small and pathetic in the vast, echoing space. Instantly, a nurse in dark blue scrubs and a stoic, broad-shouldered security guard were there. They moved with a practiced, detached efficiency that was both comforting and terrifying in its lack of emotion. Leo was lifted from my trembling arms and onto a gurney with a single, fluid motion, then whisked away through a set of imposing, swinging doors into a triage area. I started to follow, 100 frantic questions tumbling through my mind, but the nurse held up a firm hand, stopping me dead in my tracks.
"You need to stay in the waiting room, sir,"
she said, her voice calm but non-negotiable, her eyes holding no sympathy, only a tired professionalism.
"Someone will come speak to you when we know more."
The doors swung shut behind her, the soft thump-thump of their closing sounding like a final, damning judgment. I was left alone in the searing, buzzing light. Reluctantly, I turned and faced the waiting room. It was a small, soulless purgatory designed for anxiety. Rows of faded, molded plastic chairs in a depressing shade of beige lined the walls, their surfaces gleaming under the harsh lights. The source of the incessant buzzing was a bank of long, fluorescent tubes overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow that bleached all color from the room, making everything look stark and clinical. The air was thick with the cloying, sweet smell of antiseptic, a chemical scent that failed to mask a stale, lingering odor of old coffee and something vaguely metallic and unpleasant, like blood that had been scrubbed away but whose ghost remained. At the far end of the room sat a reception desk, a fortress of bureaucracy cluttered with precariously balanced stacks of paperwork, a tangled nest of phone cords, and a dusty computer monitor displaying a screensaver of slowly, hypnotically drifting geometric shapes. Behind a thick, sliding glass partition sat a receptionist.
Are you brave enough to call the dark? From the Hauntline Studios comes a vault of exclusive audio-only horror stories, so chilling you'll wish you left the lights on. No ads, no fluff, just pure, spine-tingling terror. Completely ad-free listening, only on patreon.com/hauntline.
A woman who looked as if she had been carved from exhaustion itself. Deep, bruised shadows pooled under her eyes, and her posture was a weary slump of defeat against her high-backed chair. She typed with a listless, robotic rhythm, her gaze fixed on the screen, not even acknowledging my frantic entrance into her domain. I wasn't alone, but I might as well have been. The other occupants of the room seemed less like people and more like set dressing in a play about despair, each trapped in their own private hell. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit jacket, his tie loosened, sat slumped in a chair, his face pale and drawn, staring with vacant, unblinking eyes at the scuffed linoleum tiles at his feet. Across from him, a young woman scrolled endlessly through her phone, her thumb moving in a frantic, repetitive motion, her foot tapping a silent machine gun rhythm against the chrome leg of her chair, a tiny, contained explosion of anxiety. In the far corner, an elderly woman with a severely hunched back was knitting, her bone-white needles clicking softly, a sound like chittering insects. Her lips moved constantly, murmuring words I couldn't hear, a private whispered prayer or a conversation with someone only she could see. Above them all, a wall-mounted TV flickered silently. The sound was muted, but closed captions scrolled with an unnerving slowness across the bottom of the screen, showing a generic news broadcast.
Unseasonal cold front moves into the region. Residents are advised to stay indoors and secure all windows.
Next to the TV, a large, round clock hung on the wall. Its second hand didn't sweep. It jerked, hesitating for a fraction of a second with each tick before snapping violently to the next position, as if struggling against some unseen, viscous resistance. The entire room felt caught out of time, a liminal state between crisis and resolution, and I had just been checked in against my will. My heart was still a frantic drum against my ribs from the rush. I chose a seat in a corner, as far from the others as possible, and tried to force my breathing to slow, to regain some semblance of control. The plastic of the chair was stiff and unyielding, offering no comfort, only a cold, hard reality. As I shifted, trying to find a less agonizing position, I felt something crinkle beneath my leg. Frowning, I reached down and pulled out a piece of paper. It was folded into a tight, neat square and had been wedged deep into the gap between the seat and the back of the chair. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges and soft to the touch, as if it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times by nervous, sweating hands. Curiosity, a brief and welcome distraction, overrode my anxiety for a moment. I unfolded it and smoothed it out on my lap. The handwriting was a rushed, jagged scrawl in ballpoint pen. The letters slanted and uneven, some pressed so hard they had nearly torn through the fragile paper. It was written by a hand that was clearly trembling with either abject panic or manic haste. It was a numbered list. A mix of surprise and a dark, morbid amusement trickled through me as I began to read. Rule 1. Avoid making eye contact with the receptionist between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. Do not speak to her or draw her attention in any way during this period. I raised an eyebrow. That was bizarrely, insanely specific. A prank, surely. The kind of thing bored teenagers or cynical hospital staff would cook up. I glanced over at the receptionist, who was still pecking away at her keyboard. A perfect portrait of weary indifference. The idea of some bored night shifter leaving this note to mess with the anxious and grieving made me almost smirk. It was a dark, gallows humor that fit the bleakness of the place. Rule 2. After 2:30 a.m., you must greet the receptionist if you walk past her desk. A simple nod is sufficient. Do not ignore her. A dry, humorless laugh escaped my throat. So first I ignore her, then I have to be polite? I muttered to myself. It was ridiculous. The kind of nonsensical lore you'd invent to pass the agonizingly slow, ticking hours in a place like this. Rule 3. If another visitor arrives and asks you for directions, do not help them. Do not speak to them. Pretend you cannot see or hear them. They are not lost. I paused. The amusement began to curdle in my gut. This one felt different. It lacked the quirky specificity of the first two. It was a command to withhold a basic human kindness, an act that felt fundamentally wrong, especially in a hospital, a place of supposed compassion. Who wouldn't help someone lost and worried? The final sentence, "They are not lost," echoed in my mind with a chilling finality. Rule 4. If you hear the voice of your friend or loved one calling for you from down the hallway, it is not them. Do not leave the waiting room to look. Under no circumstances should you follow the voice. The last of my amusement evaporated, replaced by a sudden prickling chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. My eyes involuntarily flicked toward the long, dark hallway where they had taken Leo. It was a dimly lit maw, stretching into shadows that the harsh overhead lights couldn't fully penetrate. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the image. It was just a list, a stupid, creepy prank, wasn't it? My curiosity was now laced with a heavy thread of genuine, creeping unease. I forced myself to continue reading, my hands surprisingly slick with sweat. Rule 5. If the lights go out, stay in your seat. Do not move from your chair. Do not make a sound, not even a breath if you can help it. Wait for the emergency lights to come on. Do not scream, no matter what you hear in the dark. Rule 6. The doors to the examination rooms should be locked. If you find one ajar, close it immediately. Do not look inside. What you see will see you back. The fine hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a primal animal reaction. Each rule seemed to descend another step into a deeper, more specific kind of darkness. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the terrifying implication behind them. That these weren't random suggestions, but reactions to established, recurring threats. They were warnings born from bloody experience. Rule 7. Do not look through the large glass doors leading to the central courtyard between 4 a.m. and sunrise. It walks there at night, and it dislikes being watched. Rule 8. If you feel a sudden intense chill, as if a freezer door has been opened directly behind you, do not look over your shoulder. Acknowledge its presence, and it will acknowledge you. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly as dry as dust. The imagery was potent, tapping into a primal, childish fear. The unseen presence, the monster just behind you, close enough to touch. I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder. There was nothing there. Just the same sterile room, the faded chairs, the buzzing lights, the silent, waiting people. But the feeling of being watched, of being scrutinized, now lingered like a foul taste in my mouth. I reached the final rule, my heart thumping a little faster now, a nervous, unsteady rhythm against my ribs. Rule 9. When a security guard tells you it is time to leave, check the clock on the wall before you obey. It is only safe to leave after 6 a.m. The hospital clock is the only one you can trust. My gaze flicked up to the jerky, struggling clock on the wall. It read 1:30 a.m., hours to go. An eternity. At the very bottom of the page, scrawled in a different, much shakier ink, a rusty, reddish brown that was flaking off the paper, were 3 words that made my stomach clench into a tight, painful knot. Trust me. I learned the hard way. Next to the words was a dark, crusted smudge, a fingerprint of sorts. I didn't need a forensics kit to know what it looked like. It looked disturbingly, undeniably, like dried blood. I rubbed my thumb over the words, feeling the rough, raised texture of the ink against my skin. It felt real. A short, nervous, high-pitched laugh escaped me, sounding loud and fragile in the oppressive quiet of the room. "What in God's name is this place?" I whispered to the empty air. I slumped back in the chair, my mind racing, trying to dismiss it. It had to be a prank, a twisted, elaborate joke designed to prey on the vulnerable. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cool, unforgiving wall, trying to focus on Leo, on the image of him collapsing, the coldness of his skin, the frantic race to get here. The reality of that was frightening enough. I didn't need to invent new, supernatural horrors. The quiet hum of the waiting room pressed in, a sound that was both a presence and an absence. It filled the space, a constant low thrum of dread. It was in that deep, isolating quiet that I heard it.
Adam. Adam.
My eyes snapped open. My entire body went rigid, as if doused with ice water. The voice was faint, a low, rasping whisper that seemed to drift on the air from deep down the hallway. But it was unmistakable. It was Leo's voice. I jerked my head towards the corridor, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might break free. The hallway was empty, just a long stretch of flickering pale lights and encroaching, impenetrable darkness at its far end. The voice came again, a little louder this time, laced with a desperate, pleading edge that twisted my guts.
Adam, help me, please.
Rule 4 screamed in my mind, the words flashing behind my eyes in bloody red ink. It is not them. Do not leave the waiting room. But this was Leo, my best friend since we were 6. He was hurt, maybe dying, and he was calling for me. The crumpled piece of paper in my hand suddenly felt foolish, childish, a relic of someone else's madness, not mine. I was on my feet before I even made a conscious decision, the crumpled list falling from my nerveless hand to the floor. The sound of my own name, spoken in that pained, desperate voice, was a hook that had lodged itself deep in my soul, and it was pulling me forward. I took a few hesitant steps, leaving the relative brightness of the waiting room behind and stepping into the throat of the hallway. I glanced back. The other visitors hadn't moved. The man still stared at the floor, the woman at her phone, the old lady at her knitting. They were completely oblivious, locked in their own private worlds, as if the sound had only existed for me, a private, terrible summons. The TV captions had changed.
Reports of localized audio-visual disturbances are unconfirmed. Authorities urge calm and to trust your own senses.
Adam.
The voice was more desperate now, thick with pain and fear. It seemed to come from deeper within the hospital's labyrinthine guts, echoing slightly, as if from a great distance. I took another step, my sneakers squeaking softly on the polished linoleum, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The further I walked, the louder the buzzing of the fluorescent lights became, a chorus of angry insects. Some of them flickered erratically, plunging long stretches of the corridor into momentary, disorienting darkness that left spots dancing in my vision. The doors to the ER rooms that lined the hallway were all slightly ajar, dark, vertical slivers of absolute blackness in the gloom. I hesitated as I reached one of these open doorways, drawn by an awful, morbid curiosity. I peered inside. My blood ran cold, turning to slush in my veins. In the center of the dimly lit room, a figure in a standard patient's gown stood facing away from me. Then, its head began to move. It wasn't a turn. It was a violent, impossibly fast shake, a side-to-side blur of motion so rapid that the features were completely indistinguishable, a horrifying, sickening vibration that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Before I could fully process the nightmarish sight, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang that echoed down the hall like a gunshot. I stumbled back, my heart seizing in my chest, a a strangled gasp escaping my lips. My breathing grew shallow, ragged, a hallucination. It had to be. Stress, lack of sleep, the flickering lights playing tricks on my eyes. But Leo's voice called again, pulling me onward, a siren song of loyalty and terror.
Adam, please, it hurts.
It was further down now, a lure cast into the darkness. I forced myself forward, my legs feeling like lead, my shoes sticking to the floor. The unsettling darkness seemed to press in from all sides, thick and suffocating, the air growing heavy and cold. I came to another room, its door also half open. Inside, the scene was a grotesque tableau of medical horror. A figure in a white lab coat and a surgical mask, a doctor, was hunched over a patient on an examination table. The doctor's movements were stiff, robotic, lacking any human fluidity. As I watched, paralyzed, he slowly raised a tool in his hand. The polished metal glinted under the dim, flickering light. It was a bone saw. As he brought it down with a jerky, powerful motion, a gut-wrenching, piercing scream tore from the patient on the table. A sound of pure, unadulterated agony that was abruptly, horribly cut off. I scrambled backward, slamming hard against the opposite wall, my eyes wide with terror, the screams still echoing in my skull. I squeezed them shut, trying to block it out, then forced them open again, looking back into the room. It was empty. No doctor, no patient, no table. Just a dark, vacant space filled with shadows. "This can't be real," I whispered, my voice trembling, a prayer to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. But the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before me, a distorted funhouse version of itself, and Leo's voice kept calling, reeling me in, pulling me deeper into the madness. I turned the next corner and froze, a gasp catching in my throat. Hanging in the doorway of a nearby room, spilling down from just beyond the frame like a morbid, greasy curtain, was a mass of long, tangled black hair. It was matted and thick, completely obscuring whatever was behind it. As I stared, a gap in the hair parted, like a stage curtain opening, and a single eye, a perfect orb of polished, pitch-black jet, fixed directly on me. There was no white, no iris, no pupil, just an absolute light-devouring blackness that seemed to pull at the very light in the hallway. A wave of profound, soul-deep nausea washed over me. The figure remained perfectly still, the silent, malevolent eye just watching, studying, knowing. I took a slow, tentative step forward, my leg shaking, and the eye retreated, pulling back into the shadows of the room and disappearing from view. The hallway was deathly quiet again, save for the low hum of the lights and the frantic, wet pounding of my own pulse in my ears. I had to pass that doorway. I forced myself to move, my whole body screaming in protest, every instinct telling me to run. As I drew level with the door, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made me look. The figure was there again, further inside the room, but now I could see more of it. It was crouched against the ceiling, its limbs bent at impossible insect-like angles, its head twisted back unnaturally high on a long, thin neck. An elongated skeletal arm, far too long for any human, its skin a pale, translucent gray, stretched out from the darkness, its bony, claw-like fingers tipped with what looked like jagged shards of black glass, reaching for me. Before I could even find the breath to scream, the hand brushed my shoulder. The touch was an abomination, a deep, cellular cold, like ancient frost from the heart of a tomb, combined with a stiff, unyielding texture like old, dry leather stretched over bone. The fingers, tipped with their sharp, glassy points, scratched into my skin. I bolted. Pure animal terror propelled me down the hallway, my shoes squeaking on the linoleum in a frantic rhythm of flight. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from that thing. I threw open the first door I saw and stumbled through, collapsing back into the familiar, sterile, blinding light of the waiting room. My heart hammered against my ribs as I staggered to a stop, gasping for air, my lungs burning. Everything was just as I had left it. The reception desk, the plastic chairs, the other visitors who hadn't moved an inch, still locked in their silent, mechanical tableaus. It was as if the entire horrifying, nightmarish journey down the hallway had never happened. But my skin prickled with the phantom sensation of that touch, a lingering stain of cold and death. I looked down at my shoulder, pulling at the collar of my t-shirt. There, stark and angry against my pale skin, were 3 thin, red scratch marks. They were shallow, but they were undeniably real, welling with tiny pinpricks of blood. A wave of dizziness hit me, and I slumped back into my chair, my body trembling uncontrollably. I fumbled in my pocket and pulled out the crumpled list of rules. My shaking hands smoothed it out again. Rule 4 seemed to leap off the page, mocking me with its stark, simple wisdom. If you hear your friend's voice calling from down the hallway, do not leave the waiting room to look for them. I hadn't just ignored it. I had walked right into the trap, and now I knew. The rules weren't a joke. They were a survival guide. They were law. I tried to calm myself, dragging in deep, shuddering breaths. I was just sleep-deprived. The stress of seeing Leo collapse, I imagined it. I tried to force the rational explanation into my brain, but the feeling of that corpse-cold hand, the memory of that lightless eye, and the stinging, bleeding proof on my shoulder refused to be dismissed. I glanced at the clock. 1:45 a.m. The minutes were crawling, each tick of the second hand a tiny hammer blow of dread. My thoughts kept drifting back to the list, each rule now imbued with a terrifying, life-or-death significance. That's when I saw him. A man I hadn't noticed before, standing near the entrance as if he had materialized from the shadows. He was tall and unnaturally lanky, wearing a long, dark coat despite the mild temperature inside. His hands were stuffed deep in his pockets, and his eyes were slowly scanning the room, lingering on each of the other visitors for a moment too long before moving on. His presence sent a fresh jolt of profound unease through me. I was certain he hadn't been there a moment ago. The list. My eyes flew to the paper. Rule 3. If a visitor arrives asking for directions, do not help them. They are not lost. The man's gaze found me. He locked onto me, and a slow, deliberate, predatory smile spread across his face. It didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and empty. He started walking toward me, his gait unnaturally smooth, a glide rather than a walk. My body stiffened, every muscle tensing. He stopped a few feet away, leaning forward slightly, as if examining a curious insect pinned to a board.
"Excuse me,"
he said. His voice was calm, but too deliberate, each word perfectly enunciated with a strange, hollow resonance. It was like a machine attempting to replicate human speech from a recording.
"Could you help me find the ICU? I seem to be a little lost."
The tone was polite, but it was a hollow shell. Something was profoundly, fundamentally wrong with it. I glanced around the waiting room. The other people hadn't noticed him. The receptionist hadn't looked up. He was invisible to everyone but me. The TV captions offered their own chilling, private commentary.
It is important to verify the identity of those you speak with. Some are not who they seem. Do not engage.
I shook my head, my hand gripping the crumpled list in my lap so tightly my knuckles ached. "I'm sorry. I can't help you," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper.
The man didn't move. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly.
Are you sure?
He asked, his voice dropping into a softer, almost coaxing register.
It won't take but a moment. It's just down the hall, right?
A pang of ingrained, conditioned guilt warred with the stark, rising terror. He looked, on the surface, like a man who needed help, but the words on the list were a flashing red light in my mind. Do not help them. I forced myself to look away, down at my own trembling hands, hoping he would take the hint and leave. Instead, I heard the soft scuff of a shoe as he took a step closer, entering my personal space.
It's not very kind to ignore someone who needs help,
he said, and the polite facade cracked and fell away. The tone was now edged with something cold and ancient and predatory. I risked a glance at his face. For a split second, it seemed to shift, to ripple like a reflection in disturbed water. His mouth stretched into a wide, impossibly broad, unnatural grin that went far beyond the boundaries of human anatomy, the corners of his lips seeming to curve up toward his ears, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp, and slightly jagged, like broken glass. I shot up from my chair, stumbling backward, a cry of terror dying in my throat. The man's impossible smile didn't waver. He turned his head at a stiff, unnatural angle, a series of soft clicks audible as his neck rotated, as if examining me from a new, curious perspective. Then, he turned away and began to walk slowly toward the reception desk. His movements were wrong, a twitching, disjointed parody of walking. He didn't go around the desk. He walked through the thick glass partition as if it were smoke, and then simply vanished into the wall behind it. My gaze darted around the waiting room. The other visitors were still there, still locked in their mechanical loops of despair. Nothing had changed. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 1:58 a.m., 2 minutes. My eyes were drawn back to the rules. Rule 1. Avoid making eye contact with the receptionist between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. My gaze flickered toward her, an automatic, thoughtless habit. It was a fatal mistake. She was staring directly at me, her fingers poised silently above her keyboard. Her eyes, which had previously been lost in shadow, were now wide open, fixed on mine with a hungry, predatory intensity that made my heart skip a beat. She wasn't moving. It was as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, waiting for me to look. I tore my gaze away, my pulse hammering in my ears. As I turned my head, a flicker of movement in my periphery told me she was getting up. Her movements were jerky and odd, her joints seeming to bend in the wrong places, like a badly handled marionette whose strings were tangled. She walked forward, and just like the man, she didn't go around the desk. She passed straight through it, a ghostly, shimmering figure stepping into the main room. I froze, not daring to look directly at her again. I squeezed my eyes shut, a useless, childish defense. The air grew frigid, a deep, penetrating cold that sank into my bones and made my teeth ache. I could hear the faint, dry rustle of her uniform fabric, the light, soft creak of her rubber-soled shoes on the linoleum, growing louder, closer with each passing second. She was coming for me. "Don't look. Just don't look," I chanted in my head, a frantic mantra of survival. My hands gripped the armrests of the chair until my knuckles were white and my fingers ached. I sat there, a statue of pure terror, convinced that if I opened my eyes, her inhuman, distorted face would be inches from mine. Then, silence. The footsteps stopped. The profound cold receded slightly. The only sound was the incessant, maddening buzz of the lights. I slowly, cautiously opened my eyes one at a time. The receptionist was back at her desk in her original position, her head bowed over the monitor, her posture as unbothered as if she had never moved. The other people in the waiting room were unchanged. It was as if nothing had happened. I glanced at the clock. 2:40 a.m. A wave of dizzying, nauseating relief washed over me. The tension in my body began to release, leaving me shaky and weak, my muscles trembling with the aftershocks of fear. I had to move. I couldn't just sit here like a trapped animal, waiting for the next rule to come into play. I forced myself to my feet, my legs unsteady. As I stood up, I remembered Rule 2. After 2:30 a.m., you must greet the receptionist if you walk past her desk. I wasn't taking any more chances. I turned toward the desk, my heart still thudding a panicked rhythm, and gave a weak, jerky nod. Hi, I mumbled, my voice hoarse. She didn't look up, didn't react at all, just continued her rhythmic, endless typing. I took that as a good sign and began to walk a slow, deliberate circle around the perimeter of the waiting room, forcing myself to breathe, to project an illusion of calm I was nowhere near feeling. But the chill hadn't entirely left the air. As I walked, I could feel it clinging to me, a subtle, lingering cold that seemed to follow my steps. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the room seem to warp and breathe around me. As I rounded the far corner, near where the old woman was knitting her endless, shapeless garment, I felt it. A definite presence directly behind me. There was no sound, no footsteps, but I sensed it with a certainty that defied logic. The weight of unseen eyes, the proximity of a physical form. It was close, just out of reach. My every instinct screamed at me to turn, to whip around, to confront whatever was creeping up behind me. But I remembered Rule 8. If you feel a sudden, intense chill, do not look over your shoulder. I clenched my jaw, my gaze fixed forward on the opposite wall. I walked faster, my pulse quickening. The chill intensified, growing stronger with every step, a pocket of Arctic air in the sterile room. The lights buzzed louder, their flickering becoming more erratic. Then I felt it, something cold and light, like a wisp of freezing fog, a spider's thread of ice brush against the back of my neck. A breath. I didn't stop. I broke into a near run, circling back to my chair and sinking into it, my body shuddering. The presence faded, though the air remained icy. I glanced at the reception desk. She was still typing. I leaned back, my heart racing, the crumpled paper clutched in my hand like a holy relic. This wasn't a game. This was a place with laws, and I was a trespasser who had broken them. And now, the only way out was to obey. I must have drifted off, or maybe time simply skipped, fractured by the wrongness of this place. I don't know how long I was sitting there, trapped in a fugue state. The next time I looked at the clock, it showed 5:55 a.m. Almost there, almost free. A sliver of hope, fragile as glass, began to form in my chest. That's when a new figure appeared in the doorway, his silhouette casting a long, sharp shadow across the floor. A security guard. He was a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a calm, almost reassuring presence. He walked toward me with an easy, confident stride.
"Sir, it's time to leave."
He said, his voice a deep, measured baritone.
"The ER is closing for non-patient visitors."
I blinked, my thoughts sluggish, thick with exhaustion and fear. But, my friend, Leo is still. Just then, as if on cue, I saw Leo walking out of the ER hallway. He looked tired, drained, but he was on his own 2 feet. He waved at me, a genuine weary smile on his face. Relief, pure and absolute and overwhelming, flooded through me, so powerful it brought tears to my eyes. I started to get up, to rush to him, but then the words from Rule 9 echoed in my head, a final, crucial warning. If a security guard tells you it's time to leave, check the clock before listening. The hospital clock is the only one you can trust. My eyes shot to the clock on the wall, above the reception desk. The jerky second hand ticked past the 12. 6 a.m. It ticked again. 6:01 a.m. My shoulders sagged. I was free. I nodded to the guard and stood up. Leo fell into step beside me as we followed the guard toward the exit. Stepping out into the cool morning air felt like taking my first breath after nearly drowning. We got into my car. I started the engine, a real, genuine smile finally touching my lips. I pulled out of the parking lot, the tension in my chest slowly, finally, beginning to fade. But as I drove, a strange, terrible unease crept back in. The world outside the car windows was still completely dark. The sky was a deep, inky, starless black, with no trace of the pre-dawn glow that should have been there. It was too dark, too quiet. I squinted, peering into the dense trees that lined the road. My heart skipped a beat, then another. In the inky shadows between the trunks, I saw them. Faint, hazy figures, their forms barely visible, distorted as if they were made of smoke and dread. All of them standing perfectly still, all of them turned to watch us pass. Panic surged through me, hot and swift. I glanced at the dashboard clock. My stomach plummeted into an icy void. The glowing green numbers read 4:30 a.m. How was that possible? It was past 6 a.m. The hospital clock had said so. I turned to look at Leo in the passenger seat, my heart pounding a frantic, terrified tattoo against my ribs. But it wasn't Leo. It was a shadow, a vague, three-dimensional silhouette of a person. Its form indistinct and wavering, its face a featureless, light-swallowing pool of darkness. But I could feel it watching me. Feel its non-existent eyes boring into my skin with an ancient, chilling intelligence. I gasped, my grip on the steering wheel so tight my bones ached. My vision blurred with terror. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a violent halt in the middle of the empty black road. Suddenly I was back in the waiting room, seated in the same stiff plastic chair. The security guard stood in front of me, the reassuring expression gone, replaced by a slow, wide grin spreading across his face, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural, predatory light. The TV behind him flickered to life, the captions haywire, a single phrase repeating over and over, burning itself into my retinas.
Time to leave! Time to leave! Time to leave! Time to leave!
"Time to leave,"
he said again, his voice echoing in my head like a taunt. My mind fractured. Had I ever left? Was this a loop? A Mobius strip of horror I was destined to relive forever? I buried my face in my hands, my breath coming in ragged, pathetic sobs, a wave of pure, abject hopelessness washing over me, threatening to drown me. It felt like hours passed, but it could have been minutes, or even seconds. I didn't know anymore. I was dimly aware of a gentle voice, pulling me back from the edge of the abyss.
Sir, your friend is stable.
I looked up, my vision clearing slowly. A different nurse, one with kind eyes and a genuine, concerned expression, was standing in front of me. The waiting room was just as it had been, but the menacing atmosphere was gone. There was no security guard. The TV was off. A soft, warm glow of genuine morning sunlight filtered through the glass doors, filling the room with a gentle, hopeful light. I glanced at the clock. It read 6:30 a.m. The nightmare was over. For real this time. I nodded, murmuring my thanks, and stumbled out of the ER. The cool morning air was a welcome balm on my feverish skin. As I reached my car, I looked back at the hospital. It looked mundane, ordinary, just a building of brick and glass glinting in the morning sun. I got in and drove home. The rising sun finally, mercifully, chasing away the last remnants of the oppressive darkness. Later that day, I returned to the hospital to visit Leo. He was awake, sitting up in bed, looking pale and weak, but surprisingly well. "Hey," I said, my voice still trembling slightly as I pulled a chair to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" He chuckled weakly.
Better than I should, I guess.
He replied.
But man, I had the weirdest dreams last night. It was like I was half conscious the whole time, watching things from far away.
My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of dreams?" Leo frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall the hazy images.
One of them was, I think I came out into the waiting room and saw you there. You looked really, really freaked out. And then there was another one. We were leaving the hospital together, driving away into the night, but it wasn't night anymore, it was just black. Nothing but black.
A cold shiver traced a path down my spine, but I forced a weak smile and nodded. "Yeah, weird," I said quietly, my mind racing with the memory of the night's events, the false escape, the shadow in the car. As we sat there talking, a constant stinging ache radiated from my shoulder. I glanced down, pulling the collar of my shirt aside. The 3 scratch marks were still there, no longer just red lines, but angry, inflamed welts. A permanent souvenir. I couldn't shake the feeling, a deep and certain knowledge that settled in my bones like a cancer. I may have escaped the hospital, but a part of it, a sliver of its darkness, had escaped with me. I knew that the rules I had been given were no longer just a list on a crumpled piece of paper. They were written on me now.
Are you brave enough to call the dark? From the Hauntline Studios comes a vault of exclusive audio-only horror stories so chilling you'll wish you left the lights on. No ads, no fluff, just pure, spine-tingling terror. Completely ad-free listening, only on patreon.com/hauntline.